Imagine you're in England 600 years ago. It's before the Tudors, the Reformation and the Wars of the Roses. This is late medieval England. It's the age of Geoffrey Chaucer. And at the moment, the 1380s, Chaucer is working on his most famous piece, the Canterbury Tales. In particular, he's working on a story called The Knight's Tale. Now, meanwhile, there's a real knight, Sir Edward Dalingbridge, and his wife, Lady Elizabeth, and they're about to move into their splendid new home, Bodiam Castle in Sussex. Now, Bodiam is altogether typical of the last real castles to have been built in England. They were built not by kings or earls, but by lesser men, knights, in conscious imitation of earlier castles.
These men were ambitious social climbers, desperate to make their mark on the world. And none was more determined than Sir Edward Dalingbridge, a rags-to-riches knight who ran all the risks involved in war and politics, but who also reaped all the rewards of wealth and power.
What follows is a knight's tale, and unlike Chaucer's, it's a true one.
Bodiam was built in the late 14th century, but its story begins 100 years earlier, in Wales. At the end of the 13th century, Edward I conquered Wales with a string of impregnable fortresses designed to enforce the submission of his new subjects. These castles were built to an enclosure design, a courtyard surrounded by strong walls. Their shape was determined by military considerations. Domestic buildings just had to fit inside as best they could. By the time we get to Bodiam, however, the priorities of castle builders had changed enormously.
It's still an enclosure castle, but the shape is much more regular. It's much more stylish. In fact, this is almost a perfect square. Now, clearly what's happened here is when the castle has been designed, accommodation has been thought about first and defence has been thought about afterwards. So, if you take away the gatehouse and the towers and the turrets on top, what you end up with is the shape of a courtyard house.
Of course, castles have always been homes to their owners, but Bodiam goes a long way towards being a house. So were its defences real ones, or just for show?
Poor old Bodiam Castle has taken a bit of a bashing in recent years, not from siege engines, but from critics, who've argued that it's not really a very defensible place at all. They've pointed out things like that big window there behind me. They've said you could easily smash a missile through a window as big as that. And they've also pointed out that the walls are much, much thinner than the walls of castles of the 12th and 13th centuries. While it's got battlements on the top, there are no arrow loops anywhere in the castle. Those tiny little openings there in that tower are just windows. But most of the criticism has been directed towards the moat. Now, the moat looks big and impressive, but, well, just have a look at this here. This is a plug hole that was put in the 20th century. And if you pulled out the plug, the water would run down through this earth embankment and come out there where the ground is much, much lower. That's the natural level of the land. But you can see, even without the plug in the 14th century, a group of men with picks and shovels could easily hack through this embankment and, it's argued, drain the moat in a day.
So why bother building a castle with such weedy defences in the first place? Well, part of it's to do with visual impact. As an attacker, you couldn't tell just by looking at the outside how thick the walls are. And the reflection in the water gives you twice the castle for your money, a fact that would not have been lost on the ostentatious Edward Dalingbridge.
So is there anything to be said for Bodiam's defences? Well, I think the answer is yes, quite a lot really. Even if you could drain this moat, you're still going to be faced with a vast expanse of mud which is going to be ankle to knee deep to get across. The only way really to get across this moat is to use the bridges. And that bridge wasn't there in the Middle Ages. The bridge originally went from here to over there. So if you're coming across it, you've got flanking fire on your right-hand side from the castle. And as you come through this bit, you've got a barbican, an outwork, with a big portcullis, a big strong gate. So even if you're lucky enough and determined enough to get to this causeway, by the time you get here, you've got a big gap where the drawbridge has gone up. And even if by some miracle you manage to get that down, you're confronted with this mighty gatehouse. Now, if you're inside this castle, you're going to feel pretty secure because the gatehouse is so well designed. You've got all the usual features. You've got murder holes, so you can chuck down quicklime or hot sand. You've got portcullises. There's a groove for a big portcullis. And you've got big, sturdy oak doors. But because it's the 14th century, you've got a new trick up your sleeve. You've got gun loops.
But are the gun loops effective, or are they just for show?
This is not the sort of cannon you'd have used against castles. This was used at point-blank range against men, soldiers attacking. So we're going to pour our charge in here. We're going to use about half of this, which is about an ounce.
Is there any danger of this exploding when it goes off?
This particular one, no. I mean, the way that this has been reconstructed is very much stronger than the originals, but the original guns did explode quite frequently. We're going to put some wadding in next. We're using grass here, but I mean, really, they use whatever they could get their hands on, basically.
Okay. Right.
And we're going to ram it home.
Okay.
It's just a piece of stick. There's nothing more technical than that.
Okay.
What we're firing out of this gun is this kind of stuff. It's called hail shot.
It's not a single projectile, not a ball or an arrow or anything?
No. Basically, what we've got here is a very large sawn-off shotgun.
So, are we ready to fire now?
More or less. The next thing we need to do is to pour some powder, and we've got a nice puddle on top of the gun. There we go. This stuff on here is called match.
A lot of matches.
Matches, yeah.
Okay.
But it's basically just some rope which has been soaked in saltpeter so that it will smoulder continuously. You didn't really aim these things, to be quite honest with you. You saw a large group of people, you roughly aimed it in their direction, and you fired, and you prayed to God it didn't blow up on you.
Right.
Have a care!
Did you get anyone?
No, I think I've scared a few ducks there.
Fantastic. Now we've fired that, which was terrific. Let me just ask your opinion on these gun loops. Are they effective or not?
Well, directly in front of us, across there, would have been a bridge, onto which guys would have had to run to attack the castle. Now, if there was a portcullis or a gate at the far end, they would have run onto that bridge and they would have been stuck there. And then at that point, they would have been in the direct line of fire of these gun loops.
Sitting ducks.
And a large cannon here with a large charge of shot would have scythed through them like a scythe through corn. It would have been extremely effective, yes.
Well, more evidence to suggest that Bodiam Castle was not just for show, but was actually a serious fortification.
I think so, yes.
Whether we think its defences were for real or just for show, there's no denying that Bodiam is a very showy castle. This is hardly surprising when you consider the personality and the history of its owner. Edward Dallingridge was a knight, a minor aristocrat. He and his wife Elizabeth were pillars of the local gentry community in Sussex. They had money, style and power. But his family hadn't always been this rich.
Edward's great-grandfather had been a mere forester at a place called Dallingridge near East Grinstead in Sussex. About the only thing that he left his descendants was the family name. But over the next 3 generations, the Dallingridges pulled themselves up by their bootstraps, and the way they did this was by making really good marriages. Edward's grandfather did very well for himself in this regard, and Edward's father Roger did even better, marrying into the local gentry and ending his days as an MP. But it was Edward himself who made the last and biggest leap forward. His wife Elizabeth was a fantastically wealthy young lady, and Edward himself became the first Dallingridge to take up the distinction of knighthood.
Edward was knighted when he was about 20, and he and Elizabeth had already been married for a couple of years. They lived together at Bodiam, not in the castle, which didn't exist, but in an old manor house inherited from Elizabeth's family. Edward, however, wanted more, and he dreamed of a new home that would announce to the world that he had finally made it.
Even today, you can still see how much pride Edward Dallingridge took in his family. Outside the main gatehouse, if you look above the doorway, you can see there are 3 coats of arms, or shields. And the one in the middle is the Dallingridge coat of arms. That's the coat of arms that Edward inherited from his own father. The one on the left belongs to Edward's wife, Lady Elizabeth, his very rich wife. And the one on the right is the coat of arms of Edward's mother, another place where the family money came from.
Above the shields there's a unicorn, a medieval symbol of virtue, and something Dallingridge added to show that he was tough and pious.
So in just 100 years, the Dallingridges had done very well for themselves, and they were very proud of that fact. By skillfully playing the marriage market, they built up an estate of about £200 a year, so Edward was a very rich man. But he wasn't super rich, he was still only a knight, and knights generally had to content themselves with manor houses, not castles, because castles cost thousands and thousands of pounds. So here's the big mystery. How did Edward Dallingridge, a humble knight, manage to build a castle like Bodiam?
One option was to borrow the money. Another was to sell some of Elizabeth's estates.
But there is a third possible way that Edward Dallingridge made money, and the clue is once again in the heraldry. Round the back of the castle, on the postern tower, there are 3 more coats of arms. The one on the left and the one on the right are both blank, but the one in the middle is the coat of arms of a man called Sir Robert Knowles. And Robert Knowles was one of the most notorious men of his age. He was a captain in the 100 Years' War, and he made an absolute fortune from the depredations he carried out against the French. Plunder, ransom, all that kind of nasty stuff. And the remarkable thing is that Edward Dallingridge was there in France with him doing exactly the same thing. So, we know from those coats of arms up there, this castle, this beautiful fairy tale castle at Bodiam, is built from the blood of French peasants.
You were working as a waitress in a cocktail bar when I met you.
Now, 5 years later on, you've got the world at your feet.
To understand how a medieval knight called Edward Dallingridge came to build Bodiam Castle, we have to look at the epic struggle between England and France known as the 100 Years' War.
Now, the 100 Years' War isn't a particularly accurate term, but it's a very useful one for historians to describe a period of intermittent conflict between England and France, which actually stretched 116 years between 1337 and 1453. Now, in the early years, this conflict went very, very well for the English. They had spectacular victories at places like Crécy and Poitiers. In the 1360s, it's not going so swimmingly, but nevertheless, it's still a great opportunity for men like Edward Dallingridge, young, ambitious men, to go off to France and make an absolute killing.
Dallingridge's first experience of the war was as a teenager in 1359, when he spent the winter with a royal army outside Paris. Over the next 20 years, Dallingridge had a good war. He went on diplomatic missions to Italy and fought in France under powerful commanders like Robert Knowles and the Earl of Arundel. He enlisted with an English force which marched 500 miles from Bordeaux to Calais and was part of a naval expedition which captured a French ship in the Netherlands. In all these actions, there were plenty of opportunities for Dallingridge to make a small fortune from the spoils of war. But if war could be a quick route to riches, becoming a knight in the first place involved making a hefty initial investment. Protecting yourself in battle was absolutely essential, and the latest technology in shining armour was far from cheap.
He is exactly what Dallingridge would look like if Dallingridge was wearing the latest, the most up-to-date, the most expensive kit. I mean, this is an extraordinary piece of workmanship. A single skull, which is actually tapered and flanged. This amazing piece of engineering is cleverly constructed so that it comes apart by removal of a single pin.
So the visor comes right off?
The visor comes right off, allowing the knight to actually breathe and talk and do any form of action until he's ready for really close combat, and then he can put it back on again.
This must have cost a packet for these people. Have we got any idea of how much this cost?
We don't have any precise evidence in terms of orders of sale, for example. These pieces are not actually made in England. We know from documents that we've got English armourers, but we don't know is of anyone who's making this quality, and the surviving pieces are attributed mostly to Italy and Germany as the two great schools. So for a start, this would have to have been imported.
So if Edward Dallingridge had the full kit like this, you couldn't nip up to London and order a piece like this. You'd have to be getting it from abroad.
That's right, yeah.
Well, that's interesting, because we know that he went to Italy in the 1370s.
Oh, well, perfect. He could have ordered it from Italy.
Yeah.
This is exactly the kind of kit that he would have had in the 14th century.
If he could afford it. Now, I'm trying to push you on this one. Can you give me a very rough figure for what we could expect that to cost? I'm expecting several hundred.
I was going to say it is going to be in terms of £300 to £400.
That's amazing, because that's twice what he earns a year from his estates. Yeah. He's got about £200 worth of land, so it's a lot of money.
Although spending 2 years' salary on armour gave you plenty of protection, it also made you more of a target.
Captured arms and armour is a major source of revenue.
Stealing other people's kit?
Yeah.
Oh, right.
Absolutely. Oh,
I
yes.
thought you got hold of other people for the person themselves and then ransomed them.
As well, yes.
But you keep their armour.
You're keeping their equipment. Yes, you are, and that is why you see a lot of pillaging of battlefields, because it was so valuable.
By sacking and looting French towns, ransoming French noblemen, and perhaps even stealing their armour, it would have been easy for Edward Dallingridge to make a mint in the 100 Years' War. In this day and age, we might frown on such behaviour, but Dallingridge probably considered himself to be a very chivalrous knight. So what did people at the time make of such mercenary tactics? Geoffrey Chaucer's knight in the Canterbury Tales got up to much the same things as Sir Edward. How did you square this idea of chivalry, of being nice to people, of sparing people's lives, with the bloodletting of the 100 Years' War?
Well, I think chivalry is often a facade, an aesthetic facade that covers up extreme violence and brutality. And that's very much the case in the description of the knight. So the description opens with this list of virtues, a catalogue describing what a wonderful, honourable man he was. A knight there was, of that a worthy man, that fro the time that he first began to riden out, he loved chivalry, troth and honour, freedom and courtesy, and worthy was he. But then it goes on to describe his campaigns. It actually specifies that he always kills his foe, and that's something which knights weren't supposed to do. It also lists the battles that he was involved in, and it mentions battles like Alessandra. And that was a notorious battle at the time. It wasn't a cause of honour, it wasn't a proper crusade, it wasn't seen as something that was fighting the heathen or fighting for a noble cause. It was basically a large group of mercenary soldiers who raided the town, and it was extremely brutal. They slaughtered everyone there. The whole town was sacked. The knights just took all their pillage and left. And I think it's that kind of knighthood that's very much criticised in the late 14th century, the idea of going to war for the sake of personal gain.
Whatever poets like Chaucer thought, many soldiers like Dallingridge returned from France rich men, intent on raising their social status. And what better status symbol than a castle? With the necessary funds to build a castle, all Dallingridge needed next was a reason. As luck would have it, the continuing war against France provided the crafty knight with all the reason he needed. In 1385, the French had taken control of the Channel and had built up an invasion force of 1,200 ships and 30,000 men. As Bodiam is only a few miles from the coast, Dallingridge could argue that building a castle was vital in case the French attacked.
When England was threatened with invasion in the 20th century, these kind of things, pillboxes, sprang up all over southern England because the fear of attack was very real. And in the 14th century, the fear of attack was very real for Edward Dallingridge too.
With the menace from the French providing the perfect excuse for a castle, all Dallingridge needed now was the approval of the king. And that meant getting his hands on a licence to crenellate. A licence to crenellate was basically a thumbs up from the king to begin building, and in 1385 Edward Dallingridge got hold of one from Richard II. Edward's original letter has not survived, but luckily kings kept copies, and in the Public Record Office the rolls reveal King Richard's record of the licence. It says, "King, to all those who see this licence,
Hello. Know ye that of our special grace we have granted
to our dear and beloved
Edwardo Dallingridge Chevalier, Edward Dallingridge Knight,
that he may strengthen with a wall of stone and lime his manor house of Bodiam, and that the castle is built, says the king, in defensionem patriae, in defence of the country against the king's enemies." The licence itself, though, doesn't survive, because Dallingridges don't survive, so none of their documents do. But it would have looked something like this. Although Bodiam has no neighbours to rival it today, in the 1380s it was one of several new castles that were being built along the south coast. But were these castles really built to see off the French, or were their owners just capitalising on people's fear of invasion?
well, This is all that remains of Cooling Castle in Kent, not a million miles from Bodiam Castle. It was built in the 1380s, like Bodiam, and up there on the gatehouse is a little charter, a little metal thing that was put up exactly when the castle was built. And it says, "Knoweth that beeth and shall be, that I was built in defence of the country." Now, I don't think you can be too cynical about that. I think if you asked Edward Dallingridge, he'd say much the same, that he built Bodiam Castle in defence of the country.
Of all the new castles which sprang up on the south coast, Bodiam was by far the most dazzling. It's not just a building, but a perfectly proportioned work of art.
Now, everybody's reaction when they see Bodiam for the first time is they go, "Wow, what a great castle," because that's what it looks like. It's got this fantastic big wide moat, it's got a lovely big gatehouse, it's got crenellations, it's got round towers. It looks like a perfect fairy tale castle. Now, there's nothing accidental in this. It looks that way because Edward Dallingridge asked for all these features. He told his architect, "I want an all-singing, all-dancing castle with knobs on."
One of the most striking features of the castle is its courtyard interior. By Dallingridge's day, an increasingly sophisticated economy meant that great households no longer needed to move around as much. With local markets able to meet their lavish needs, they could settle in one principal residence. To provide permanent accommodation for a household of perhaps 40 people, Dallingridge borrowed a classic medieval pattern, but not from a castle.
This is the front quad of Jesus College in Oxford, and this is a 16th century college, but as you can see, the layout of it is very much like a medieval college or a medieval castle like Bodiam. Over here, you've got accommodation in this range. On the back, you've got a great hall, and to one side, the kitchens, which serve it. And on this side, they've got the builders in here at the moment at Jesus, but there's a chapel there. So everything that's necessary for a household or a college community is packed in within these four walls.
So if Bodiam's inner courtyard resembled an Oxbridge quad, what about the inside of the actual rooms in the castle? For that, a little expert guesswork is needed.
Tell me a little bit about the room we're in here. We've got this, what I take to be, from the guidebook, Dallingridge and his lady wife's chambers. What were these rooms like in the 14th century?
You must imagine the windows being glazed. You can see the bars for the glazing there. And quite possibly the glass would have been stained. So you must imagine colour coming in through the windows. Secondly, not only do they have the fireplaces, but as you can see, the fireplaces are very ornate. The one in the upper chamber even has little battlements on it.
Oh, yeah.
So you don't just have the battlements on the outside of the castle. As you actually walk in and through, this motif keeps getting repeated.
That I did spot. That is very, very interesting.
Yes.
It's got no room to put knickknacks on top of the mantelpiece, but there are, I imagine, lots of knickknacks in the room itself.
Probably glazed pottery, lots of metalware, a lot of pewter, a whole series of different things of that kind. But it's important to remember with Dallingridge that you've got somebody here who is not quite at the top social stratum, although clearly very wealthy and clearly
moving up fast.
And clearly moving up fast. So much of the stuff that he would have would not necessarily be quite of the top level. So for example, you might expect tapestries on the walls, but it's more probable here that instead of tapestries, you've got wall hangings with paintings on them, slightly less expensive, but nevertheless very colourful, very grandiose.
I just see him as such a sort of up-and-coming guy. The stuff he's moved out the old manor house, and eventually Lady Dallingridge is saying, "We've got to lose that. It's just so kind of middle class." And you know, we'll get some tapestries one day, dear. So what's in this tower that is next to the Dallingridge's apartments?
Well, the tower probably functioned as a suite of ancillary rooms to the private suites that we've just seen on that side. But one of the things you've got in here is this wonderful series of latrines. You can see the archway, the two archways, one above the other here, and then they're both sharing the same chutes going out into the moat. The latrines here at Bodiam actually discharge directly into the moat.
Oh,
so when you think of the romantic theme of Bodiam as this wonderful sheet of water, you've got to remember you're actually looking at an open sewer here. There's a huge number of toilets here at Bodiam. There's over 20 fireplaces. It really is accommodation on a quite magnificent scale. It's almost as if the accommodation itself is part of what Dallingridge is trying to display to the world. He's really trying to say, look, I'm a great lord here. I can offer huge amounts of hospitality. Guests are always welcome in my house.
The state-of-the-art lavishness of Bodiam, paid for by 20 years of looting and pillaging in France, cemented Dallingridge's position in the top echelons of Sussex society. Both his pocket and his ambitions had been well served by the war. On his relentless rise to the top, Edward had made some very powerful friends, but he'd also made some very powerful enemies. Arundel Castle in Sussex is one of the largest castles in England. In the 1380s, its owner, the Earl of Arundel, was one of the richest men in the country and had serious political clout. As a wealthy patron, Arundel employed a number of retainers, basically his paid supporters. And the rising star among these men was one Edward Dallingridge, who, 50 miles down the coast, was busy building a little castle of his own. As Arundel's right-hand man, he felt strong enough to take on anyone. One morning, Dallingridge rode out to hunt. But on this particular morning, it wasn't just deer he was hunting. His prey was political. Well connected through his powerful patron Arundel, and well protected by his own wealth and senior position in the county, Dallingridge was throwing his weight around, playing a dangerous game with high stakes.
He's trespassing, and he's doing it to make a political point. It's a direct challenge to the authority of his newest neighbour, a man called John of Gaunt. Now, John of Gaunt is not a man you cross lightly. He's the king's uncle and arguably the most powerful man in the kingdom. By hunting all over his land, Dallingridge is picking a fight with a man he sees as an outsider, someone interfering in local affairs and sticking his nose in where it doesn't belong.
Dallingridge's trespass was meant to be noticed. Along with the rest of the Sussex gentry, he resented Gaunt's recent acquisition of huge estates on his patch. But Gaunt, incensed by the actions of this nouveau riche upstart, took Dallingridge to court.
Now, the reason we know about the conflict between Dallingridge and John of Gaunt is because of this wonderful summary of the proceedings in the court that's recorded on this contemporary roll. You can see Dallingridge is mentioned there at the top, Edwardus Dallingrig, and there's John of Gaunt, styled John, King of Castile and Duke of Lancaster. Now, what emerges more than anything else from this summary account is the kind of man Dallingridge was. It gives you a little window onto his personality. He comes across as a man with a really fiery temper. In fact, twice he throws down his gauntlet and challenges his accusers to a duel. You can see the word duellum just there. Now, in reward for this very theatrical performance in court, he's charged with contempt and fined nearly £1,000. And he's then thrown into prison until that fine is paid. You can see there's an order to the sheriff to keep him in safe and secure custody. The thing is, he doesn't remain in prison for very long.
When John of Gaunt popped off to Spain, Dallingridge's patron, the Earl of Arundel, stepped in and had a word in the king's ear. The fine was never paid, and Dallingridge was soon out of jail and restored to his position at the head of Sussex society. Edward got off the hook because he was well connected. Bodiam Castle, which he started building around the same time, was designed to help him play the patronage game. It was intended not just to impress his inferiors, but also to entertain his betters, like Arundel or the king. There's only one entrance to Bodiam now, but in Dallingridge's day, a second bridge led to the back door.
So this area here, that looks like a kind of patio or veranda where you could have enjoyed your gin and tonic, is in fact where that bridge came in. And you're coming into the tradesman's entrance. This is where the food, the wine, the beer, the salt, anything would have come in this way to serve these two rooms. You come into a passageway. There's a room that side behind a wooden screen, which is the Great Hall. And there's a series of rooms this side behind this stone screen. And it looks like three big windows. In fact, it's three doors. This door here on the left goes into a room called the buttery. Not for butter, but for bottles. It's a corruption of the word bottles. And this side, you've got another door straight into a room called the pantry, a corruption of the French word pain, bread in there. So you've got bread in there, bottles in there. And between the two, stepping up because there's floorboards that have vanished, coming between the two rooms, you've got a passageway. And that passageway is leading you to a room which is the great kitchen. Come down to the bottom of this tower because you can see at the bottom this is where you get your water, a well. Now, the well contains the same water, I'm afraid, as the moat, but don't worry, it's not for drinking. This water would have been brewed into ale or used for boiling or washing or that kind of thing, so no problems there. And if you look up to the top of the tower, which you can do because there are no floors anymore, at the top you can see lots of little holes, about 600 of them. That's a dovecote. There you would have had doves, obviously, doing whatever doves do, nesting or roosting, what have you. And those doves, I'm sorry to say, were for eating or at best for laying eggs. So that's the well tower. Coming back into the kitchen and thinking yourself back to the 14th century, you can imagine this place as a hive of activity, getting ready for a big dinner. You've got an enormous roaring fire here, lots of cooking going on, because it's got to produce sufficient food, and by sufficient I mean, of course, a lot, for Sir Edward, for Lady Dallingridge, and their guests. Because you're going to have to fill this room full of food. This is the Great Hall. And as Great Halls go, it's pretty small, pretty dinky. It's about 40 feet long, about 25 feet wide. And let's just describe the service arrangements here. Well, you've got two, maybe three tables, long tables with long benches for the Dallingridge's household, the plebs, if you like. And at this end, you've got a big, long table the other way, going lengthwise, and a big window to keep it nice and well lit. And this is where the Dallingridge would have sat. Edward would have sat here at the top, Lady Dallingridge beside him, relatives and friends here. So the whole thing, that gives you a flavour of what it's like. The whole thing, a very medieval way of living and dining, you might think. In fact, it's a dining arrangement that survives today in a very medieval place.
It's dear old Oxford again. At Jesus College, the medieval separation is preserved between the nobility on the raised dais and the plebs on the benches below. And just as in Dallingridge's day, the food for top table is significantly better than the stuff that's served to the proles. For their starters, here at Jesus, it's pâté de foie gras for the fellows and vegetable terrine for the students. At Bodiam, the menu was a little different. The late 14th century is the first time we know exactly what rich men like Dallingridge were eating, because the first ever recipe book in English appears in the 1390s. The form of curry, which is just a corruption of the word cookery, was written by one of the cooks to King Richard II.
What kind of things are we going to be eating in a household like Edward Dallingridge's?
Well, the first thing he'd look for is some game, because that's always high prestige.
Right.
And I'm going to be doing some pigeons, which were counted as game, but were farmed in the castle. Chicken livers, we think of chicken as a very cheap meat, but that's a recent development. Then we're looking at spices, very expensive, very high prestige.
What's the spice?
There's cloves, cinnamon, and some mace in there.
Right, now that sounds to me, if we're in the Middle Ages, this sounds to me sort of expensive stuff.
Very, yes.
This is coming from the Far East?
Yes.
Or the Middle East?
Indonesia.
Right, oh gosh, that is a long way.
Some 14th century dishes called not only for expensive ingredients, but also for a good deal of creativity and imagination, like the so-called train roast.
The train roast is dried fruits and almonds, and they've been strung on a piece of string.
What, is that where the train thing comes from? Where's the train idea there?
The train comes from, it's the term for deer's entrails.
Ah.
This is a joke dish. The medieval people loved joke dishes, things that didn't look like what they were, or had surprises in them, like 4 and 20 blackbirds baked in a pie. And this is one of them. It looks like, when it's finished, it will hopefully look like deer's entrails, but it's dried fruit.
I hope this is a
nuts.
funny joke.
You don't look convinced.
Well, the idea of going to elaborate length to make something look like deer's entrails, yum yum yum. But anyway, let's
Cooks went to great lengths for the subtleties, the joke dishes.
So here's a 14th century feast that would have been strictly for top table only in Dallingridge's Great Hall at Bodiam.
Right.
And that's the macraws,
Pasta.
the pasta cooked with butter and cheese, the chicken livers, or garbage as the dish is called, and that's the train roast, supposed to look like deer's entrails,
And the pigeon.
and the pigeon, which is served with the wine and orange sauce.
Right. I can just imagine Edward Dallingridge with the Earl of Arundel or something saying, "And now, my lord, deer's entrails." Yeah. Right. And of course, I shouldn't be eating this. I should be serving it. If you can take my apron off for me, so I look presentable. And then through to the high table with this. Because this kitchen isn't any old kitchen. It's the kitchen at a place called Penshurst Place in Kent. And as you can see, on the back of the kitchen is this lovely 14th century hall. So let's just get rid of these. Nice dinner for one there. This hall is almost exactly the same kind of hall that Dallingridge had built at Bodiam Castle. It's quite a lot bigger, but the arrangement is exactly the same. And you can see there's exactly the same service arrangement as there is at Bodiam. You've got this passageway here, and the 3 doors, once again, one to the buttery, one to the pantry, and the passageway through the middle of them up to the kitchen. And this screen, the screen that's vanished at Bodiam, is still here at Penshurst, and up on top of it, there is a gallery. And if there was a feast here, you would have minstrels on top.
Minstrels were versatile entertainers. As well as performing songs of courtly love, they might also juggle, dance, and recite poetry. As well as having them play at a big feast, a rich patron like Dallingridge might have retained a troupe of minstrels for weeks or even years at a time.
Mary, you've got a fantastic range of medieval instruments here, and these are all reconstructed ones, aren't they?
Yes.
I imagine this is a harp. What are the strings made out of?
Gut.
Gut.
There is various treatises from the Middle Ages about making strings for fiddles and harps. And there's a lovely one which says that they can be made either of sheepy's gutties or of wolfy's gutties. Okay. But that something to the effect that you mustn't mix the two up, because if you do, the wolfy's gutties destroyeth and corrumpteth the sheepy's gutties. This is called a portative organ. They appear in English art from round about 1300.
Oh, okay. So Edward Dallingridge has probably heard one of these.
Oh, yes. From Robertsbridge Abbey, there has survived some very early, well, it is apparently, they say it's the earliest surviving keyboard music.
Robertsbridge Abbey is just a few miles away from
Yes,
Bodiam Castle.
yes.
So what we have here is a manuscript written in Edward Dallingridge's day, in Edward Dallingridge's backyard.
Yes.
Once Sir Edward's guests had been well fed and well entertained and were ready for bed, they would have retired to one of the castle's towers, which, as you can see, contain spectacular guest rooms. Up there you can see that this room had 2 windows, both of which have window seats and both of which would have been glazed. As you move round, you can see that there's a fireplace, so they would have been nice and warm, and next to that there's a tiny darkened doorway which led off to a private toilet. So Edward had spared no expense in making his guests feel nice and comfortable and at home. A man like his patron, the Earl of Arundel, would have felt that Edward was trying really hard to keep him happy.
But at a stroke, Edward's efforts to curry favour with Arundel suddenly looked in vain. In 1388, Arundel was one of the leaders of a rebellion against Richard II, but within a year, the king had crushed the rebels and was restored to the throne. Dallingridge may have seen off the challenge of John of Gaunt, but if he now lost his patron Arundel, everything he'd struggled so hard to achieve might be lost. Edward's future hung precariously in the balance. In 1389, Sir Edward Dallingridge has pretty much got it all. His flashy new castle at Bodiam is well underway, he's fabulously rich from his exploits in the 100 Years' War, and he's got a very powerful patron in the Earl of Arundel. But then Arundel challenged the king's power and lost. By rights, Dallingridge should have fallen with him. But he didn't. Instead, in the very same month, Dallingridge craftily changed sides and joined the king's council. Before long, he had become one of the king's most trusted and busiest advisors.
People tend to make and keep records when there's money at stake, and Edward Dallingridge was no exception. This is his lovely little expense account for the year 1392, when He's a royal councillor, and he's billing the king for his travelling expenses. And it enables you to see him running around all over the place. Here he's charging the king for a trip to London, just there. And he's gone to Stamford and Nottingham. He's even gone to Woodstock in Oxfordshire. Altogether, he's spending 207 days in the king's service. So Bodiam Castle in 1392 is nearly finished. But Edward Dallingbridge, spending all this time in the saddle in the king's service, isn't getting a great deal of time to enjoy his new house.
When Edward was away on business, his estates in Sussex didn't just manage themselves. With the help of a trusted steward or manager, his wife Elizabeth was in charge. Her ability to act as lady of the manor was probably part of her appeal to the dashing Sir Edward.
Of course, Elizabeth's primary attraction when Edward came to marry her was her huge tracts of land. But it probably wasn't her only attraction. It's often assumed that in the Middle Ages, men only married because they wanted to get their hands on land or because they wanted to get children.
But they also wanted companions, like we do today. They wanted someone to help out with the management of their households and their estates. So although we don't have much information about Elizabeth, we can guess from her background that she was a very well-educated lady, and she would certainly have been able to read. But the reason the Dallingbridges were able to read in the first place was down to their religious education. They probably had their own prayer books, which began to appear in English during their lifetime. They would certainly have regarded themselves as pious people. The chapel at Bodiam tells us that.
Now, chapels in castles are nothing new. As long as you've had castles way back to the 11th century, they've had chapels in them. But there is something new in the 14th century. If I come up here through this bit, which would have been the room for the priest and his vestments, you wouldn't have come up through the priest's room when it was built. I'm going through a vanished floor here and go up this ladder. I come to this window at the top. Now, this room that I'm stood in was an oratory, or a private pew, where the Dallingbridges would have come in through their private apartments, which are back there. They could have attended chapel without actually having to go to the service and mix with their household, who would have been stood there. So they can sit here and listen to the Mass in private. And that's what's happening in the 14th century. People are not becoming less pious, but their piety is becoming much more personal.
This move towards a more personal devotion is underlined by the nobility's increasing use of private confessors in preference to public church services. The importance of religion to Dallingbridge is seen in the design of Bodiam. The only feature that breaks the symmetry of the castle's exterior is the chapel window, through which Dallingbridge announced his piety to the outside world. So the castle elegantly combines two apparently conflicting functions. It may be a flamboyant status symbol, but it also conforms to the spiritual code of the time, of contemplation, confession, and atonement. And Sir Edward Dallingbridge, the warrior knight who'd spent his youth plundering on the battlefields of France, might have felt he had plenty to atone for. Other knights at the time clearly had a lot on their consciences.
Chaucer's knight is described as someone who's been on all these battles, who comes back from his voyage, from his travels, in order to go on pilgrimage, and that's the rhyme. And he's dressed as if he's in penance. He's dressed very scruffily, and you could see that he's come back from fighting all these bloody wars, and now he's going to atone for his sins and atone for all the things that he's done wrong, and that's why he's on pilgrimage, as a kind of penance.
By 1393, Edward Dallingbridge had served as a king's councillor for 4 years. During that time, he'd negotiated treaties in Brittany, surveyed the fortifications at Calais, and, by skillful diplomacy, ended a bitter dispute between the king and the citizens of London. By this time, Bodiam Castle was probably finished, and the 46-year-old Dallingbridge might have been looking forward to some quality time in his sumptuous new home. But in August that year, at the very height of his power and influence, his life was cut short. You can see from some of the clues on this monumental brass, incidentally, monumental brasses are a 14th century thing, you can see from some of the clues that this is definitely a Dallingridge tomb. This chap here, on his mail shirt, has got the engrailed cross, which is the Dallingridge coat of arms. And up here, you've got another Dallingridge coat of arms, this part of the tomb, and there's a unicorn there, the same thing that features on the front of Bodiam Castle. If you look at the figures, you can see how the Dallingridges wanted to be remembered in death. They're both very pious, they've both got their hands pressed together in prayer. But this guy here has got no shame about displaying his martial qualities, his military background. He's got a sword down here, he's got all his armour on, no shame in that. Now, I have to confess that this isn't Edward and Elizabeth Dallingridge, this is his parents. May I introduce Roger and Alice Dallingridge, and they're buried here in the parish church of Fletching in Sussex. Now, the Dallingridges we've been dealing with, Sir Edward and Lady Elizabeth, being that much grander, were buried not in a parish church, but in a Cistercian abbey. They were buried at the Abbey of Robertsbridge, just a few miles west of Bodiam. There's no record of how Edward died. Perhaps it was gout from all those fancy dinners, or a lingering war wound sustained on the battlefields of France. There's no obituary in any chronicle to describe how, through brilliant soldiery and astute political manoeuvring, he reached the very top of the social and political ladder. Nor is there any effigy to mark the end of this knight's tale. The Abbey at Robertsbridge was destroyed long ago in the 16th century.
But in a way, it doesn't matter that we haven't got Sir Edward's tomb, because we've got his wonderful castle. Remember, the Dallingridges had started out as humble foresters, but Sir Edward ended up as a king's counsellor, and who knows, had he lived longer, he might have risen even further still. But even as it stands, Bodiam Castle is a fitting memorial to the man and his great ambitions.
After Bodiam's time, castles in England continued to change. No longer needed for defence, they evolved into the great houses and palaces of the Renaissance. Built just 50 years later from gaudy red brick, Hurstmonceux is a very mannered castle indeed. A far cry from tough-looking Bodiam. In the history of castles, Bodiam stands at a turning point. It looks back nostalgically to the great fortresses of Edward I, and it looks forward to the courtyard houses of centuries to come. The castles of late medieval England might look tough and imposing, but at heart they were elegant, peaceable, and thoroughly domesticated. Late medieval Scotland, though, that's another story.
And you can hear that